Hello, friends. So today I'll be talking on this new molecule, Aviptadil. For all my ICU friends, 2 years back, I had spoken about this molecule in the thick of COVID. When COVID, we were in the raging second wave of COVID. This molecule was spoken about, but that molecule wasn't available at that point of time. So this molecule, Aviptadil, is launched on 21st November 2022, few days back in India. The trade name is Oxiptadil. So from 2 years to now, so there are a couple of trials that have happened in this Aviptadil. So it is imperative that we go through them, try to understand about this molecule and see if this holds promise in patients with ARDS. So this is so that would be the overview of this particular talk. So this was the first article that came, the use of intravenous Aviptadil for critical COVID with respiratory failure. So just a brief about this molecule. Aviptadil is vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. So initially, when they introduced this molecule, it was coded as RLF 100. The molecule name was RLF. Um, so the content is vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. So the way it acts is, so in our lung, we have type 1 pneumocytes and type 2 pneumocytes or alveolar type 2 cells, whatever we call. So the 5% of the cells within the alveoli are type 2 pneumocytes or alveolar type 2 cells. And these cells exhibit receptors called VPAC receptors and ACE receptors. So aviptadil, which is vasoactive intestinal polypeptide, predominantly acts on this VPAC1 receptor. So it pretty much acts on about 70% of these VPAC receptors. By acting on these receptors and on the ACE, so what it does is it improves the oxygen transport at the alveolar level. So it improves the oxygen transport. And because of its action on the VPAC receptors on the type 2 pneumocytes, the integrity of the type 1 pneumocytes, predominantly alveoli has type 1 pneumocytes, and type 2 pneumocytes also are needed to maintain the integrity of type 1 pneumocytes. So it maintains the integrity and it improves the surfactant production. And type 1 pneumocytes look like this. So it maintains the integrity of the type 1 pneumocytes. So that is one of the mechanism of action. And by acting on these VPAC receptors on the type 2 pneumocytes, it prevents NMDA mediated activation of caspase 3 because this is a activation of this caspase 3 within this alveolar space leads to production of a lot of inflammatory mediators. By preventing the activation of this caspase 3 through NMDA, it prevents the exudation of alveoli, exudation of fluid within the alveoli, and prevents the non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema that typically happens in ARDS. And it inhibits the production of IL-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha and possibly other inflammatory markers within the alveolar space. So the intra-alveolar inflammation or inflammation within the lung, which is typically the case in ARDS, is mitigated by preventing this caspase activation. And it improves the surfactant production. And we understand in ARDS, the production of surfactant is valuable in maintaining the alveolar integrity. So by these mechanisms, it tends to improve the outcomes or at the cellular level, it seems to have beneficial effect in ARDS. So this is at the cellular level or at the alveolar level. And this is another just a pictorial representation as to the cell formatting within the alveoli. As you see, all these green ones are the type 1 pneumocytes and this blue one is the type 2 pneumocytes of the alveolar type 2 cells. And all the inflammation that happens within COVID is through its binding to the ACE2 receptors, which are predominantly expressed by these type 2 pneumocytes and the inflammatory cascade that gets activated. So this Aviptadil tends to act on these VPAC receptors and tends to prevent this activation of the inflammation at the alveolar level. So if you understand that much, that should be good enough. And as you see, these VPAC receptors are these brown ones and the AC2. So all these cells get activated, produce inflammatory and cytokine storm by activation of these receptors on which this Aviptadil acts and prevents the activation. If you remember that, that should be good enough. And another important thing the listeners should bear in mind is the vasoactive intestinal peptide. As the name sounds, it's an intestinal peptide. It tends to act on the GI tract. So one of the side effects when you use Aviptadil is diarrhea. So that we'll talk in the clinical trial. So it acts on the GI system, it acts on the respiratory tract, and it has activity on the immune cells. It has some activity on the in the brain also, at the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So, but the side effects of this can be GI, and the diarrhea is one of the side effects we have seen in the clinical trials that has been published. And at the alveolar level, as I said, by that multimodal action, it tends to maintain the integrity of the alveolar capillary membrane, and it restores the barrier function at the alveolar capillary junction. And the good thing is Aviptadil is not a brand new molecule that has not been tested. This molecule has been present since 20 years, and this has been used in various formats in sarcoidosis and ILD, pulmonary fibrosis also. This has been used, and ARDS, this has been used. And the initial study, when I presented around 2 years back, was a case series in ARDS in 8 mechanically ventilated patients, where this showed profound improvement in the gas exchange to a point that 7 patients were extubated and were alive at 5 days, and 6 patients were discharged. So this was the case series that was published in the thick of COVID time, and it showed some sort of a hope and optimism with the usage of this molecule. And during COVID, they had used this molecule in a patient with COVID who underwent double lung transplant. There was a 54-year-old gentleman who underwent double lung transplant for whom Aviptadil was used, and they found a favorable outcome. So the dosage, and subsequently they did a case series in around 15 patients where they found favorable outcome, and that was not been published. There's only a mention that this was used in 15 patients. So at that point of time, the dosage in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, so this has a role. So the important thing about this molecule is it has a role even in ILD, interstitial lung disease, and pulmonary fibrosis. So the dose that is suggested, and as I said, this molecule has been present since 20 years, and it has been used in the dose of 50 to 150 picomoles per kg per hour over 12 hours as infusion. So this was our understanding until this molecule, until this COVID happened. And after that, few trials have happened. So we are here to discuss the trials to see whether it holds promise. And the good thing is now this molecule is available in India for us to explore its usage and explore its benefit. So this was a trial done in India, and this is published in this European Journal of Pharmaceutical and Medical Research in 2022. And this is a sponsored trial and done by Bhupesh Diwan, who was part of our GIGS, who presented this data. So this study was done in patients who were admitted between April 2021 to 22. Sorry, I put as 2021 to October 2022. It was a randomized double-blind phase 3 trial, 1:1 randomization. So here they took 150 patients with COVID respiratory failure, patients who are having COVID and respiratory failure and who had developed ARDS. So all the studies that you will be hearing with Aviptadil is predominantly done in patients with COVID ARDS. And the interventions here, they used these 150 microgram was given on day 1 as an infusion over 12 hours, followed by 300 micrograms as an infusion on day 2, 450 micrograms on day 3 as an infusion. So this has to be given as infusion over 12 hours. So primary endpoint was to look at resolution of respiratory failure. And secondary endpoints they looked was improvement in the WHO 7-point ordinal scale. I'm sure all the COVID studies, if you recall, the listeners, you would know the improvement in the respiratory failure was scaled on a 7-point or 10-point ordinal scale. So here also they looked at 7-point ordinal scale and improvement. They looked at improvement of PaO2, FiO2, survival, and adverse events. So this was the sort of a framework of the study that was conducted. So when you look at the results, 147 patients were finally taken up for evaluation. 74 were in Aviptadil group, 73 in the control group. And as you see, this was a very positive trial. So the respiratory failure resolution was 2.1-fold better than control group at day 3, and that was statistically significant. At day 7 also, it was 2.6-fold better, the respiratory failure resolution as compared to the control group. And the time to resolution of the symptoms was much earlier in Aviptadil, 7 days as compared to 14 days in control group. And they even looked at the clinical progression towards improvement in the symptoms at day 3. So progression of symptoms towards improvement happened significantly better in Aviptadil. As you see, 32.43% of the patients had symptomatic improvement from worse to a better stage as opposed to the control group. And even this improvement happened up till day 7, which means symptomatically patients started feeling much better clinically up to day 7. In Aviptadil group, there were more patients as compared to control group who experienced improvement in the symptoms. And more than 2-point improvement on the ordinal scale at day 7 happened more in patients in Aviptadil group as compared to the control group. Risk of death was reduced, but it did not attain statistical significance. There was 20% risk reduction, but it did not attain statistical significance. And PaO2, FiO2 at day 2 to week, when they looked, it showed significant improvement in the Aviptadil group. And death, it happened less in Aviptadil, although it didn't attain statistical significance. So all in all, hugely positive study, basically telling there was respiratory failure resolution, improvement in the symptoms up to day 7, ordinal scale improvement up to day 7, and PaO2, FiO2 improvement also. All these were significant in Aviptadil group. So the conclusions author made was Aviptadil was safe and effective in resolution of respiratory failure, and the time to recovery also was significantly reduced, and it significantly reduced the respiratory distress in a patient. So this was the conclusions in the Indian study. Then came this, then this US trial happened. This was published again in 2021. So the title was Vasoactive Intestinal Peptide in the Treatment of Critical COVID-19 with Respiratory Failure in Patients with Severe Comorbidity. So it was a small study. This was possibly, I would put it as a pilot study. I just presented the Indian study first. Before this US study come. It's a small study which came in 2021. Prospective open label done between patients admitted in June to July 2020. As I said, all the trials I'm speaking is in COVID ARDS. And follow-up of these patients was done for 60 days. Again, the dose here they used was 50 picomoles per kg per hour for 3 days. 100 second day they used 100 picomoles per kg, and third day they used 150 picomoles per kg. So for all the listeners, this 50 picomoles per kg per hour for a standard 60 kg will translate to what I mentioned as 150, 300, and 450 micrograms per day as 12 hours. So that's why in Indian study, you would see that as a standard dose that is recommended. So picomoles per kg will translate to around that much for a average weighted person, 60 kg weighted. So it was a small study, 45 patients, 21 in the Aviptadil group, 24 in the control group. They looked at day 60 survival, 81% Aviptadil survived as compared to 21% in control group. And the respiratory failure recovery, the cumulative probability, it increased 9-fold higher in Aviptadil, and that was statistically significant. And the 10-point ordinal scale improvement at day 28 and day 60, there was 2.6-point increase in Aviptadil. In control group, there was 3.5-point decrement. So which means, again, all statistically significant, although a small study showed improvement in all the endpoints. And radiological improvement also significantly happened in Aviptadil. 17 out of 21 showed radiological as compared to 1 out of 24 in control group. So, and ECMO decannulation also happened more successfully in Aviptadil, 4 out of 5 compared to 3 out of 13 in the control group. So all in all, hugely positive study. So showing that Aviptadil holds promise in showing significant improvement. So after this came this other, this is the latest trial, which is still preprint. It is still not published. So effectiveness of Aviptadil in accelerating recovery and shortening hospitalization in critically ill patients with COVID respiratory failure, which was a phase 2B multi-center trial. So this is a preprint. Just keep a note on this author, Yusuf, because all the studies that I'm showing from the US are by this author, Yusuf. So even this previous trial is by Yusuf JG et al. From US, and the second trial, which is preprint, also is from the same author. This was a randomized double-blind phase 2B trial. Here they looked at 28-day and 60-day endpoints, and this study was a multi-center trial. They did it in 10 US hospitals, 196 patients, randomized 2:1. The inclusion, here they took sick patients, COVID, who were on HFNO. 127 patients were on HFNO, and 32 were on NIV, and 36 were on mechanical ventilator. And dosage, again, it's 50, 100, 150 picomoles per kg, which will come to around 150, 300, and 450 micrograms per day as infusion. When they looked at the results, 131 were in the Aviptadil group, 65 in the control group. They looked at day 28 survival, not much different between Aviptadil and control group. And they looked at the subgroup of patients on HFNO of 28-day survival. There was a strong signal towards statistical significance, but did not attain. As you see, hazard ratio was 1.53, P was 0.08. So there was a strong signal towards improvement in survival, but did not attain statistical significance. When they looked at length of stay, there was a median reduction and it was statistically significant. Aviptadil group had a significantly reduced length of stay. Serious adverse events, there was no difference between Aviptadil and control group. And as I said, diarrhea is something that is a problem with VIP. So Aviptadil group had 30% diarrhea as compared to control group 1.5%. And 28-day in-hospital survival was found to be much better with Aviptadil, 37% as compared to, 28-day in-hospital, who remained in hospital was less, which means the length of stay was reduced in Aviptadil and more patients were discharged. It was less in Aviptadil as compared to the control group. So this was the second trial, which is a preprint, which showed, as you see, any trial for that matter, even if you looked at the Merrick's cocktail, now all these trials are by Youssef et al. So small trial, you take huge statistical significance. Once it goes to multicentric with more numbers, we are not seeing benefit in mortality, and we are seeing secondary endpoints which seem to have benefit, which is length of stay. This is a typical narrative in any sort of a trials that happen with the new molecule, which you are seeing with Aviptadil also. So again, this author, yeah, so here this is a case series in non-COVID ARDS. So all this time you have been hearing about COVID. This is a non-COVID ARDS due to sepsis, where they have done a case series. And this case series also is by Youssef et al. The name, the way it is put is changed. It's the Youssef Jihad et al. So it is from the same author case series. They took 8 ARDS patients with sepsis who are on mechanical ventilator. The dosage they used was the same, 50 to 100 picomoles per kg as 12 hours infusion. So serious adverse events were nil. 7 out of 8 patients were extubated and 30-day survival was 7 patients. 1 patient had hypotension and diarrhea, and 2 deaths were not related to ARDS. One was due to secretions and one was due to CVA. So again, this is just a case series in non-COVID ARDS due to sepsis, where they showed a favorable outcome, again by the same author. Then again, the same author, you can see Youssef et al. Case report, 32-year-old female, G6 with a obese BMI 42, developed co-ARDS. They used remdesivir, methylprednisolone, and enoxaparin. And here patient was on HFNO needing 100% on 60 liters with intermittent BiPAP. Again, they used the same dose, 50, 100, and 150 picomoles, and patient was successfully weaned off HFNO. The reason I'm highlighting this is this molecule is safely used in pregnant lady also in ARDS, and we understand that during COVID, we had, the morbidity was high in pregnant patients, and we did witness that. So this was also successfully weaned off HFNO and BiPAP. So all in all, you would see that this is all the evidence we have for Aviptadil. So a case series, a case report, and maybe we had 3 trials, as you see, 1 from India and 2 from US. But some of the observations I would make. So this is the X-ray of this pregnant lady from day 2, the ARDS, the way it looked, and how it progressed to day 6 with a good radiological resolution. So my observations on Aviptadil would be this. There are 3 studies until now, 1 Indian study, 2 from USA, 1 case series, and 2 case reports. And all these, as you see, the data comes from a single author, Youssef and his team from USA. So that is one of the things that listeners should bear in mind. And the Indian study is a sponsored trial. So this is the current data we have on Aviptadil with regards to the evidence that is available. And all trials, so far you see the 3 trials that we have just spoken about has come in COVID patients. So we do not know how this molecule will work in non-COVID ARDS. So possibly we need to make good observations in non-COVID ARDS as to how this molecule will hold promise. So larger trials definitely are needed in non-COVID situation, because now COVID is gone from India and pretty much in the world at large. So we need larger trials in non-COVID ARDS, and possibly a good observations have to be made in non-COVID ARDS to make logical conclusions. And some of the limitations one could think is all the data like vitamin C came from Merrick. This data seems to be emerging from Yusuf et al. So we need to possibly generate more data in our Indian subcontinent in non-COVID ARDS, and a multicentric trial is in order. But physiologically and hypothesis generating wise, this seems to hold promise, but we need to make more objective sort of observations in a well conducted randomized controlled trials in a multicentric format within our country to have greater acceptance of this would be the my submission. So thank you one and all. So end with this beautiful quote: circumstances don't make the man, they only reveal him to himself. So you can visit my website and hear to this lecture. So I would leave it at that. So right now we have used this molecule for one patient within our ICU, ILD with ARDS. He seems to have responded, but it's too early to say. So we will discuss this more as we start using this molecule more. So thank you, one and all.